Greetings everybody, and welcome to my first of two-part series, small series albeit, on the First World War, also known of course as the Great War. And if you haven't had a chance, I would strongly suggest you have a look at my Causes of World War I lecture before you start this, simply for the fact that it goes into great detail all the complex aspects that led up to this war. And for our purposes, we're going to be launching right into the war itself. So, of all the things that I teach and of all the subjects that I've studied in history, this is probably one, for whatever reason, I'm still not entirely clear why it seems to resonate with me so much. Probably to some degree it has to do with the futility of this war, the senseless waste of life, the tragedy of the hardships faced by the soldiers in the trenches. There's just something very, very frustrating about this war in particular. All wars are frustrating, but all these young men who found themselves in the fields of Flanders, in the muddy patches of Passchendaele, or facing gas at the Battle of Ypres. It's just a narrative that I never tire of hearing about because it continues to amaze me as to how tragic this war was. Just to comment on a couple of the pictures here. Here you have some nurses tending to soldiers, and they're all, of course, wearing gas masks. First time gas had been used as a weapon on this level before. Column of troops. That's a great picture with the reflection in the water. This is the kind of propaganda you had: destroy this mad brute. It's the kind of things you saw, which would make you want to enlist. Soldiers eat babies. That's a fact. It's pretty horrible. And of course, sitting in the trenches. One thing I always like to say to my students when we talk about this, and sort of as a precursor as we move into life in the trenches and some of the key battles, is that this was a war that initially was fought with a 19th century mentality, but fought with 20th century technology. And what I mean by that is that the last war that Europe had been engaged in on this scale were the Napoleonic Wars, which were concluded in 1815 by the Congress of Vienna. So there was nobody alive who had a memory of a war on this scale. Yes, of course, there were people alive who remembered the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, who may have been involved in the unification wars of Germany, whether it be with Denmark or Austria, or going back a little further, who may have memory of the Crimean War. But other than those localized regional conflicts, it had been 100 years since Europe had been engulfed in a war of this size. So really a very remarkable story to be told. So I'm just going to move right ahead. In the last lecture we talked quite a bit about the Schlieffen Plan, and I think I have a map here. This is sort of just a very general map. Here you've got Belgium. The Netherlands is up here. The green is France, and the blue is Germany. Basic philosophy is that you strike through Belgium very quickly, march through, curl around behind Paris, take Paris, and then hopefully sweep forward to continue your advance on to Russia. So, why did this plan fail? The number one reason why the Schlieffen Plan did not work as it originally had been planned to work was that the Belgians gave stiff opposition to Germany in August to October 1914. Now, of course, the Belgians did not have an army the size and power to repel the German army, but they could slow them down. They would blow up their own infrastructure, blow up their own train tracks. They would create these barriers of these mangled trains that the Germans would have to move out of the way. And so the trick was for the Belgians would be just to slow them down as much as possible. I mean, if you could stop them, that would be great, but slowing them down was key. German troops were exhausted by late August, having marched since August 3rd. You know, the Germans had been on foot and moving ever since, and it should be noted, we can't proceed without talking about the atrocities committed at the hands of the German troops on Belgian civilians. There was a tremendous amount of anger and resentment that the Germans felt towards the Belgians, and you know, the brutality, the murder, the rape is fairly well documented. There's no question that there was a lot of letting out of frustration and anger on the Belgian population. And word, of course, got out pretty quick what was happening. But they continued to march all the way in through October. So they've been on the move for 3 months. The Kaiser completely underestimated the British Expeditionary Force as a contemptible little army who arrived quickly to play a crucial role in the Battle of the Marne. Battle of the Marne, of course, is one of the very, very early battles when the war was still relatively mobile. Now remember, trench warfare didn't begin right away. That develops as a result of the fact that armies were facing artillery fire and machine gun fire, and they needed to cover, so they had to dig down in some cases. But in the very the late summer of 1914, the BEF is moving its way into place. Delays by the Belgians and the British Expeditionary Force allowed France time to march north in defense of Paris. So fortunately, with the introduction of the BEF moving quickly into France, you know, Paris, the defense of Paris was paramount, because if Paris was to fall, there's of course the symbolism of your capital city falling, but Paris is the heartbeat of France. So the railway networks travel through Paris, and it's almost like by taking Paris you would completely disrupt France's ability to fight a war which they would then have to fight on from the outside in. So the defense of Paris was really very, very important in this war. The Battle of the Marne from September 5th to 19th saw the exhausted Germans fall back, and then Paris was saved. So because the Germans had been on the move for 3 months and the French and the British were waiting for them, they were much more, they were far less, of course, exhausted than the Germans. So the Germans, it was a good fortune, I think, for the Allies that Germany was pretty tuckered out by the late summer of 1914. Despite the Marne, the Battle of the Marne, Germany still controlled most of the northeast of France and Belgium, and sought out the principal ports, the channel ports of Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne, all three of which, whose names have haunting and chilling memories of the Second World War as well. You know, ideally what Germany wants, now that Belgium is under their control, now that the northeast corner of France is under their control, is to maintain, of course, access to those port cities as well. So that's where they're going to hunker down. That's where we begin to see them digging in, because while you might not be able to advance forward, the philosophy is you don't want to retreat either. So then you dig down and you hold your ground. As the British Expeditionary Force marched to protect the ports, they met the Germans at Ypres, and after 1 month of fighting, 20,000 Germans were killed to Britain's 8,000, but the ports were secure. So the main thing is that Britain was very, very key. Why were they so key? Because that is the way in which they sent troops and supplies to France. Calais is important because it's the shortest distance between France and Britain, between Dover and Calais. So maintaining that part of France under Allied control was extremely important for the British in their ability to fight effectively and move supplies and troops into France. After the first major clash at Ypres, the war was no longer mobile, and both dug in for the winter, resulting in a line of trenches from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Now, I don't want to make this sound like it happened overnight. It didn't, but at the end of the day, once the mobility of the war began to really bog down, that's where the digging in came in. And you know, the reason we'd never seen anything like this on this scale is because armies in the past had never had to deal with machine gun fire. You know, mounted machine guns, you know, could decimate an army. You know, if you've got half a dozen men with, you know, tripods and machine guns, you know, they could just completely destroy an army, you know, just spit bullets by the thousands across a plain. So machine gun fire is a real game changer in the First World War. You know, we'd seen versions of the machine gun before, in the Gatling gun it was called, and that was the one that you actually would crank. I believe it was used in the Riel rebellions. The Gatling gun was used in the Franco-Prussian War. But now you have automatic, you know, machine gun fire, which is a whole different game changer. So that's when things begin to dig down. By Christmas of 1914, by the truce of 1914, we'll talk about, was a result of tremendous disappointment by both sides that the war was not over by Christmas. Now, let's have a look at these pictures here. Here you have a very interesting picture of some British and German soldiers, right? Just hanging out. Here you have a painting of German and British soldiers sharing a Christmas Day together. There's a little tree here, and then there's a picture of the kind of devastation we saw. Christmas 1914 was a grim day for everyone. Because the old refrain that the war will be over by Christmas, and this was not the first time it had been used, everybody knew that it was not over. And most of the troops who were sitting in the trenches in 1914 are completely depressed, down and out. They're wet, they're cold, they've witnessed bloodshed they never could have imagined before this. Maybe they themselves were wounded. And what happens is a fascinating thing. Now, it should be noted that the Christmas truce did not happen in one isolated event. It happened in several locations on the front, but the most well-accounted version was one that included, I believe, French and Scottish troops on one side and German troops on the other. And the story goes something like this, that the Scots and the French were sitting in their trenches. It was Christmas Eve, and everybody was just praying that just tonight, please tonight, let's not bomb each other. Let's just have some silence and maybe get a good night's sleep in preparation for our battles tomorrow. And apparently the French and the Scots suddenly heard a melody. They heard singing emanating from over no man's land. No man's land is the area of the trench that is in between the two enemy trenches. Usually pothole filled, body filled, barbed wire, you know, shrapnel, you name it. It's a horrible, horrible place. And the Scots are saying, hey, wait a second, I know that song. They're singing Silent Night, Holy Night, which is actually a German song. Many of the old Christmas carols that we know and love come from Germany. So the Scots begin to sing in English. And then the French begin to sing in French. And everybody's trying to outdo each other and sing louder than the enemy. And then, very daringly, some soldiers began to poke their head over the trench. Now, poking your head over the trench was always very, very dangerous because of sniper fire. Well, I guess under the circumstances, some soldiers thought it might be safe to have a look and see what was going on. And when they looked over the trench, they saw a line of little trees sitting on the top side of the German trench with these colored balls on it and what was tinsel, or a type of tinsel. So they hear the melody of Silent Night, Holy Night, and they're looking at these Christmas trees. Now keep in mind that the Christmas tree had not been adopted across the board in the Western world. The Christmas tree, like the song Silent Night, Holy Night, was a German phenomenon. And of course later the Christmas tree would be incorporated in our Christmas celebrations as well. So the decision is made. Now first of all, people are saying, hey, the Germans want a truce. And many said, they don't, it's a trap, they're setting us up, they're going to pull us out like cheese in a bait and in a trap, and then they're going to spring it on us when we come out of the trench. So they said, well, let's throw up a white flag. A white flag is thrown up, and then the Germans do the same. I can't remember, it might have been the Germans who did it first, but either way, the commanding officers of each trench come out, they meet halfway, they exchange a few awkward words in broken English and French and German. They agree, they go back and they tell their guys, you'll never believe this, we've agreed to a trench. Agreed to a truce, rather, not a trench. So they're told, look, get your cigarettes, get your chocolate, your meats, your cheeses, whatever you've got, because most of the troops got these nice rations from the front, or from back home rather. Packages are coming from families and stuff for Christmas. So they all come out, and can you imagine the moment as they work their way into the middle of no man's land? They awkwardly nod and motion to share stuff. They're smoking, they're drinking. They end up having quite a wonderful time. And on Christmas Day, the truce continues. And apparently in one section, because the trenches were relatively new at this time, it wasn't too pothole filled, and they would play soccer. And I believe the Germans won. I don't know for certain, but I seem to recall reading that somewhere. And then the next day, I can't remember if it was midnight on Christmas Day or if it was 8 a.m. Boxing Day, whichever it was, the point came where they were now going to resume activities. Now, two things to consider. The decision to have a truce was made locally. The generals who make the decisions are several miles behind the trench in their chalets with their maps and their cozy fires and cognacs, making decisions with, poring over maps and sending notes to the front and so forth. When they caught wind of what had happened, all the Allied armies and German army commanders included, said, under no circumstances can we ever allow this to happen again. This is fraternizing with the enemy, and if it happens again, people will be court-martialed and shot. So the Christmas truce of 1914 was the only time that we ever saw anything like this. And it is a one little moment of tremendous goodwill and brotherhood that existed. And the irony, of course, being is that when these soldiers hung out for that day or two, they learned that, oh my gosh, Fritz is a farmer like me. He's got 2 kids. Or Joachim is a lawyer just like me, and they're tattered and they're dirty and they're suffering from shell shock and they've got wet feet. And it was the moment at which that all the soldiers realized that they were all kind of suffering the same misery, and that all the demonizing of the German enemy that had been spoon-fed to them over the course of the previous year, they realized that these guys are just like us. And then one begs the question, what the heck are we fighting for? Well, what is this all about? So either way, Christmas Truce of 1914 is a remarkable story, and but the only time it ever happened on the front. Well, once things began to settle in, the grim reality was that this war was no longer going to be mobile, that we are in the ground, we've dug in, and we're likely going to be here for a while. So what was their day-to-day life like? What did they have to contend with, aside from constant artillery barrages? Holy mackerel, they had to deal with the trauma of experiencing the war on a daily basis. So we're going to look at all the things that these soldiers had to deal with. Here's a picture of a bunch of soldiers who have caught lots of rats. Rats, unfortunately, were a major problem. Unfortunately, rats had a lot of food, for lack of a better term, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the fact was that there were dead bodies and body parts everywhere in no man's land, and it just accelerated the rat population, unfortunately, so it's pretty grotesque. Here it says, trench foot. Keep your feet dry and clean. Well, easier said than done in the trenches. Here's some troops just sitting enjoying a meal, and there's some French troops just kind of hanging out in their home in the trenches. So, The boredom. The days were long and boring, with little variation in diet, like tinned bully. These are what the English mostly ate, or Tickler's plum and apple jam, along with hard biscuits. Cooking facilities were basic, and all food was cooked together, while water was brought in petrol cans where chlorine of lime was added to kill the germs. This made for an awful taste, and melted snow and ice was preferred as drinking water in the winter months. Hygiene was a major problem, with few opportunities to wash, leading to lice and disease. The lice, of course, were coming from the rats. Just to give you an idea of what they faced, trench foot. Let's talk about trench foot. Trench foot was an issue where soldiers' feet were constantly immersed in wet, dirty, filthy water. And so boots were everything. I mean, the Germans had really good leather boots. They tied up tightly to just below the kneecap. That's what you wanted. You wanted your feet to be completely, tied in, dry. And so trench foot, it basically is like gangrene. Your feet begin to rot. And so when the day was over and they go to bed, they take off their socks and let their feet dry out. But the problem was when they went to sleep, if you could sleep, the rats would come out, and before you knew it, they'd be nibbling on your toes. So then you would have to put your wet socks back on. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. But despite the fact that they were dealing with trench foot and they were dealing with shell shock, which we'll talk about as well later, I would argue that the most predominant enemy of the soldiers, other than the horror of witnessing the war, was chronic sleep deprivation. This was night after night after night after night of constant artillery bombardment, and sleeping was a luxury. And we all know how we feel if we get 3 or 4 hours one night. All we can think about all day is, oh my gosh, I can hardly wait till I can go to bed and get a good night's sleep tonight. And if you get that good night's sleep, the next day you feel so good because you slept well. Well, just imagine one day rolling into the next. A lot of the shell shock, the mental anguish, the stress, all that stuff was exacerbated by this chronic sleep deprivation. So, rats, as we said, trench foot, we talked about boredom, fear, depression, and extreme weather conditions punished the soldiers on both sides. There was no reprieve. Springtime, it's getting warm. The trenches are drying. That's great, because they've been dealing with cold and wet. But then the spring warmth turns into summer heat. And summer heat brings on dust, brings on thirst, brings on discomfort in your uniform from sweating, So you crave a little cold, you crave a little damp, and then the fall rains come, everyone's breathing a sigh of relief, but then the muds come. And, dealing with mud in the trenches, we will see in Passchendaele, was horrific. And then when you get fed up with the mud, it freezes and you think, oh thank God, the mud's frozen, we can now walk around. But then the cold gets to them. So it's almost like every season and the change of every season brought new challenges. And you were never comfortable because you never washed your uniform. You wore the same uniform for weeks and weeks and weeks. You rarely had a bath. So, there was just, for these poor boys in the trenches, there was no reprieve from chronic discomfort, I guess is the best way to put it, and all these things as well. Alright, I don't want to spend too much time here because I don't know how well you can see it on your screen, but here you can see a typical trench. So you've got, a lot of times you're standing on these boards because there's so much water in the trench. You got to keep your feet out of the water and above so you're not slipping around. That's where he would step his foot. He's got his guns here, kind of built inside, an elbow rest here, and this is where he shoots from. Now oftentimes back here, this is where the soldiers actually slept, was underneath the ground, and they would build these wooden frames to hold up the earth. And so it was constant shaking and rattling and dirt coming down. This is one of the complex underground tunnels. Sometimes they would try to build tunnels underneath the enemy and then let off a mother load of bombs, and we'll talk about those kind of things shortly. This is an example. And then the labyrinth of the trenches. You have a front line trench that was connected to a back line trench, and then headquarters and dugouts. And you know, it's amazing, these poor soldiers, they were living like animals in the earth, essentially. The earth was their home. So, quite something. All right, let's look more at the dangers. Snipers waited for unsuspecting soldiers to poke their heads over the parapet, or those careless enough to strike a match for their cigarettes. You know, that was the number one cause. So if it's dark out, you know, you might want to be stretching a bit, and you'd stand up in the trench, oh, nobody can see me, and everyone smoked in those days. So you'd have your cigarette, and there would be snipers on the enemy side of the trench waiting for people to fire up a smoke. And if they didn't get you when you struck your match, they would get you when you pulled on your cigarette, because the red end of your cigarette would glow, and that would become like a beacon. Pow! So guys are getting knocked off in the middle of the night because they're smoking. And of course they would learn not to smoke above the trench line. So that was huge. Shrapnel from constant bombardments maimed and killed. Shrapnel terrified the soldiers because, you know, when bombs explode, they spit out thousands of particles of metal that would rip through your arms and your face. And that's why there was so much horrific disfigurement of soldiers who didn't just lose an arm and a leg, but might lose a chin or half a face or lose an eye or what have you. So, you know, the evidence of these soldiers was everywhere in the post-war world. I mean, everywhere you walked in the world, particularly in Europe and in Canada and the United States, you would see, you know, veterans hobbling with you know, rather crude-made prosthetics, and or facial masks and all kinds of things. So, I mean, shrapnel was terrifying, terrifying. Poisonous gas and the fear of it absolutely haunted soldiers. I mean, after the Battle of Ypres in April of 1915, there were Canadians, of course. I believe that was our first action as Canadian troops, and we were unfortunately the first to be gassed. So it was a terrible situation, because when those Canadians were gassed at Ypres in 1915, they didn't know what was coming, because nobody had been gassed before, and you know, people thought it was just a low cloud, you know, and it kind of rolls in. You can see it rolling through the trench like a snake, you know, and then when it hits your nose or your lungs, you were done for. And you know, basically what's happening, the gas gets into your lungs and it melts your lungs, so you end up choking essentially on your own fluids. I mean, it's just an absolutely horrible, horrible situation. I remember when I was about 12 years old, my stepmother, she used to do in-home care for people, where she would go and make dinners for people, and this is in the James Bay area, Victoria, BC, and I remember going with her a couple of times, and there was one fellow who was a World War I vet, and he was blinded by gas in World War I, and the only thing, I'll never forget this, the only thing that he could eat was boiled eggs and Premium Plus crackers. It was the only thing that didn't upset his stomach, because the gas not only gets into your lungs, but you can ingest it into your stomach, and it can actually mess with your intestines. And so gas is terrible stuff. Shell shock and the constant fear of being hit reduced some men to nervous wrecks. Shell shock, the generals thought it was men simply being unmanly. You're being a coward. We now know that shell shock was actually something neurological. It did something to your neurology. I mean, you were actually discombobulated. Your body was completely thrown off center. And then there's the mental trauma as well. So today, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. That is shell shock. And we are still dealing, even with veterans from Afghanistan who are coming home and dealing with all kinds of trauma after the war. And still lots of issues with that. Many who suffered from shell shock were accused of cowardice and were shot, yeah, and that is just absolutely tragic, you know. Here you can see this young soldier bent over and doubled over, who's just overwhelmed with the mental anguish and the you know, just the whole experience of this war. Soldiers envied the wounded who were sent home, and many deliberately shot themselves in the leg in hopes of being sent home. Boy, oh boy, imagine that. A guy gets shot and you're thinking, oh, he's so lucky he gets to go home. Maybe I'll just shoot myself in the leg. And many did that, but the problem is that generals and trench commanders began to realize that soldiers were doing this, and if you were caught with a self-inflicted wound, I'm not sure how you would capture someone doing that unless somebody else saw you or the bullet in your leg was from a Lee Enfield bullet or whatever. But either way, if it was proven that you gave yourself a self-inflicted wound to get out of the war, you could be court-martialed and executed. And oftentimes, when troops are executed for this kind of thing, they would be executed by their own troops in their own, you know, their own group. So it's a pretty horrible set of circumstances. Well, technology, boy, those of you that are interested in technology, does it ever take a leap in this war? The flamethrower consisted of a can of gas carried on a shoulder's back, connected to a hose, but often exploded and killed the soldier. What a risk. You've got a can of gasoline on your back and you're blowing flames everywhere. If there's a bit of if it spits back or something, a bullet hits your canister, you can figure out what's going to happen. Gas first used in the Second Battle of Ypres, as we mentioned earlier. The Canadians were there in April 1915. In its chlorine form, but was more deadly as mustard gas, appearing in 1917, which was odorless and had no color, so you couldn't even see it. You didn't even have the opportunity to defend yourself. The machine gun could fire 600 rounds in a minute and cut down lines of attackers, causing huge casualties. And of course, coming back to the beginning, that's what led to troops digging in the first place, was the threat of machine gun fire. Artillery was the use of heavy field guns intended to bombard the enemy trenches and were located well behind the trenches, intended to destroy enemy trenches before an assault. So, you know, there was no reprieve. You know, if there was ever, you know, when there was silence, I've read so many reports when soldiers, when November 11th happens, the silence was deafening, you know, for these soldiers. They couldn't believe the experience of having a long stretch of quiet. It was actually almost traumatizing for them. So, tanks were clumsy and broke down, but had improved by 1918 to play a factor in victory. So tanks evolved very, very quickly. By the Battle of Cambrai, 1917, I believe, the tank was pretty useful. When the Germans first saw the British tanks, they were like, oh my gosh, what the heck are these things? They're quite terrifying because they could actually mow right, they could go right over top of a trench. But the problem was they're sitting ducks for artillery, and once they broke down, they were useless. I mean, they were very slow and cumbersome anyway. They looked fearsome, but they weren't very reliable in the early stages of the war. All right, so most attempts to break through were made by the Allies because the Germans were happy to remain on the defensive since they occupied Belgium and much of France. The Germans never really felt as strong a need to break through as the Brits because they were already in occupied territory. And what the British and the French and the Canadians and later the Americans had to do would be to push those guys out of northeastern France and out of Belgium. The other thing to keep in mind too is that because the Germans were very mobile in the beginning stages of the war, they were very sure to occupy hilltops, right? So defensively, they were usually in the better position because they placed themselves in positions of better defense. And, you know, so when we get to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, you know, the Canadians had to march uphill, you know, to attack the Germans who were on the top of the hill. So, Germans were the first to build trenches and had picked higher ground. Here we go. And as a result, the Allies resorted to a war of attrition. January 1915, the French attacked Champagne and were stopped by machine gun fire, where 100,000 troops were killed for a mere 8 kilometers gained. And this is the beginning of the horror show of the Battle of Attrition. The Battle of Attrition. Attrition basically means that you are just going to continue to throw as much artillery, manpower, and gunpowder at an enemy, and eventually you will overcome them. There may be a lot of casualties, but we shall overcome. To steal from the American Civil Rights Movement. But the problem with this kind of thinking is that what happens if the other side is practicing the same philosophy? Right? Both sides are just sending wave upon wave upon wave of men and ammunition at each other, and millions of people are dying, hundreds of thousands, and nobody's gaining anything. I mean, you know, if you gained half a kilometer, it was seen as a great victory. Any move forward was seen as a victory. And as the war dragged on, you know, newspapers in the major centers of Berlin and Paris and London and New York and Montreal and Toronto and everywhere else were desperate for anything that they could tell their populations that we were moving in the right direction. So, in April 1915, the Germans attacked the British and Canadians at Ypres using poison gas for the first time, but did not break through. They held their ground, you know, and of course, I seem to recall that it was a Canadian who figured this out, but I don't know with absolute certainty, so you might want to look at it yourself. But before they issued gas masks, somebody figured out that by urinating on your handkerchief and covering your nose and mouth, the uric acid in the urine would somehow stop the gas from getting through, and you would not ingest it. How and why, so I'm sure the person who thought of it must have been a science major or a professor, someone who actually understood, you know, that urine had properties that could save your life. Who would ever thought that? But so yeah, I guess somebody had figured this out, and then but then they began to issue masks. So at Loos, British and Scottish troops faced machine guns. Because of the kilts, the Germans nicknamed them ladies from hell. So even in battle, the Scottish wore kilts. And I would imagine, frankly, they probably were more comfortable, except maybe in the winter. But yeah. So. All right. Okay. Well, Gallipoli. Where is Gallipoli, and why was it even remotely significant? You know, we focus so much on war on the Western Front because that is really, that is like the heartbeat, if you will, the epicenter of World War I. But we have to remember that there were brutal battles and engagements occurring between the Russians and the Germans on the Eastern Front, the Battle of Tannenberg and in East Prussia and that region. There were naval battles occurring on the Atlantic. There were naval battles occurring all around the colonies of Africa as well, and certainly in the Middle East there were battles between, because now the Ottoman Empire had become allies with Germany and also the Austro-Hungarians. So we had to contend with Ottoman you know, control of the Middle East, and you know, the British would get in there too, because you know, once again, the Middle East oil was something that everybody wanted to get their hands on at this time. So when Turkey joins Germany in October of 1914, Britain attacked Gallipoli to knock them out of the war. That was the purpose of this. Now, if you have a look at this map up here, here you have what is modern-day Turkey. This is kind of the ball. Here's Greece, right? The Middle East, sort of Israel's here, and Syria. But this is Turkey. This is the Black Sea, and the yellow is Russia. Russia were our allies, and the Allies would send supplies to Russia and Russia to the Allies through the Black Sea, because the problem is the northern ports in Russia and the Baltic were frozen over, so it was deadlocked. So the Black Sea access for Russia and its connection to the Mediterranean and then out through the Atlantic was really very important. So Gallipoli, from our perspective, was very important not only to knock the Ottomans out of the war, but to maintain those lines of communication with our Russian comrades. Unfortunately, our Russian comrades would pull out of the war in 1917 as a result of a revolution. So coming back here, this is the Mediterranean, and this is Gallipoli. I think they marked it here. The Dardanelles are these thin waterways that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And this is where the action was. We need to knock them out of the war and ensure that access. As Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill came up with the attack plan. It's interesting. I mean, I think Churchill was right. I think Churchill's strategy was correct. The problem was the planning of Gallipoli was the problem, not the idea that this was geopolitically important for the outcome of the war. Because later, in the Second World War, as Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill would become quite obsessed with the idea of hitting the Nazis from the soft underbelly in Italy, right, in the same Mediterranean location. So he really understood the Mediterranean as a key part in both wars. Britain wanted to break through the Dardanelles to free up the strait in order to help their allies Russia in the Black Sea by capturing Constantinople and knocking Turkey out of the war. Turkey was not Turkey yet, though they were the Ottoman Empire still. It would be a naval attack because the British Expeditionary Force was too busy in Europe, but the Turks had mined the straits, leading to 3 British battleships being destroyed. Anzacs would be sent in from Egypt, but poor planning and outdated maps. Anzacs are the Australian, New Zealand. I can't remember what ACS, African Corps, I'm not sure what but it's African New Zealand troops sent in from Egypt, but poor planning and outdated maps led to a slaughter of the Anzacs. The mission was a huge failure. This doesn't really show it very well, but when they arrived on the beaches, these are all cliffs here. And the Turks were on the top, basically shooting down on the Anzacs like fish in a barrel. So, I mean, you know, not only were these battleships mined on the way up these Dardanelles Straits, but when they got to these beaches, they were completely decimated by the Turks. So, Gallipoli was a real tragedy, actually. I think they underestimated the ability of the Turks to really defend themselves very, very well. Well, let's look at why it failed. I mean, for the Turks, this was a holy war to drive out Christian invaders, and they were more than willing to give up their lives for victory, so this was like a jihad, I guess, for lack of a better term, right? This was a holy war. The Turks knew the invasion was coming, so they strengthened their defenses. I mean, you have a great advantage if you know that the enemy's coming. So, many in the British High Command did not view Gallipoli as important as the Western Front, where Kitchener believed victory would occur, so maybe there wasn't as much of an emphasis on this battle. The British did not do any preparation or practice, and the outdated maps were a huge liability. The Army and Navy should have fought a combined operation, but they were done separately, so there was no coordination. Now, maybe this was a legacy of that colonial mentality that, oh, hey, everywhere we've gone, everyone's been a pushover. We shouldn't have any problems here. We would just go in there and our very presence will intimidate them and they will shudder. But that wasn't the case at all. So the plan was far too ambitious and there was not enough thoughtful strategy involved. That is the tragedy of Gallipoli. It wasn't well planned. All right, and I think for our purposes that's where we will stop, and we're going to pick up right into early 1916, late 1915 in part 2. So thank you very much for coming and having a look at my YouTube lecture. If you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to send a note on my YouTube page. All right, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Take care.